Hi, I'm Gina-R-Farrar, reinvention coach, creator and host of Feminine Roadmap podcast, and leader of this amazing global community of women. If you are approaching midlife or are already in the thick of it, welcome home. Please grab a cup of something wonderful and join me for some real talk, practical strategies, and a big dose of sisterhood. I am so glad you're here. Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. Welcome back to Feminine Roadmap Podcast, the podcast that helps you navigate the challenges and changes of midlife and to craft a dynamic second half. Today, we are going to be talking about the need to allow ourselves to be hungry for all sorts of things, including food. And my guest today is dr-gia-marson. She's a psychologist and the author of the Binge Eating Prevention Workbook. Gia, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, I haven't really had this conversation, so I was interested to find out, what is it that led you to this specific mission and message?
When I was in graduate school, a couple of people close to me developed eating disorders, and I was shocked because I did not know much about eating disorders at the time. And so I started writing all of my papers on eating disorders because I wanted to understand what was going on with them. By the end of graduate school, I had become not an expert because I wasn't even done with graduate school, but I quite knew a lot and decided that was the area of specialty I wanted to go into. And I've been working in that area for 2 decades.
That's amazing. I think more people probably have issues than we realize. Did you find that to be true?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the spectrum, right? So it goes from people who are in the hospital to because they're either malnourished or they're having problems based on some kind of an eating problem, or people who are kind of flying under the radar, either partially recovered or haven't quite acknowledged the problem. We normalize a lot of difficulties with food because it is so much in the mix of our culture to be pathologizing our relationship with food and our bodies. So I think it's actually hard for people to recognize when they have tipped over into, okay, now you need some help.
I've often felt that food is challenging only because we need it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. When, I read about it and people will say this is like being an alcoholic or whatever. And to your point, it isn't like that because we can live without alcohol. It may not be the choice someone wants to make or have to make to be healthy, but we can't live without food. And so in a way, it's like saying you have to have a glass of wine every night or 3 times a day. You have to face your fears over and over again every day. And actually, that's what makes it possible to fully recover, though, because you have to face it.
You use the word fear. That's interesting. Do you find that fear is part of the relationship that people have with food?
I think fear is part of our culture. And I think fear has gotten to be more part of our culture as we've gotten more polarized in terms of politics and science and health and all kinds of things. And we are told now, there's so many messages about what a certain weight or a certain weight classification will do to our health or our lifespan. We're told to eat this if we want longevity or if we want this or not eat that. There's so many rules. And I think for the most part, we kind of want to get things right. Like most people don't want to be unhealthy. Most people don't want to have problems in their relationships. Like most people want to be in homeostasis. They want their bodies to be well, their relationships to be well, and their lives to be long and happy. But when we're bombarded with messages of fear, it's very hard to know how to go about that.
That's so true. And you had mentioned for my intro that we need to allow ourselves to be hungry for all sorts of things. What does that mean to you, Gia? What do you mean by that?
Well, I've never put it exactly that way. So it was kind of fun when you just asked me, like, what's your message? Because it in a way, it really comes down to such simplicity that as I do this work specializing in eating disorders, I also am a generalist psychologist. So I see people with all kinds of problems. And the common denominator of a lot is I shouldn't have these emotions. I shouldn't be this hungry. I shouldn't be this needy. I shouldn't want more pay. I shouldn't want equal rights. I shouldn't want, it's a lot of trying to shut down what we want. And as if having a big life is wrong.
That's really interesting. We do should all over ourselves, don't we?
Absolutely. 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 And with food, what happens is we're kind of by nature strangely oppositional. Although we want to get everything right, on the one hand, we also don't want to be told what to do. We like autonomy. We want the freedom to say what we want. So when we're told, don't eat this, don't eat that, don't be this size, don't be this shape, don't be this color, don't whatever, actually that ends up being what we kind of want to do. So we lose track of what our inner self is really telling us we want, because we're either listening to these external shaming messages or we're living in opposition to them. And it takes a lot of work now. I think this is all the self-care talk and mindfulness stuff. It takes so much more work now to figure out, what is it I actually want? What food do I want? What food makes me feel good? What food gives me energy? Because we're either punishing ourselves, trying to follow the rules, or we're trying to make up for punishing ourselves or trying to follow the rules and not doing it well. So who am I, just left alone on an island, if I could eat however I wanted and I wasn't worried about what anybody else thought except to feel good? What would I do?
I would say that probably most people are disconnected from that and don't know how to answer that question. Do you find that to be true?
Yeah, I think we are. Not only are we being bombarded with messages, but we're choosing to be bombarded with messages. And that choice we make on a pretty consistent basis, whether it's turning on the TV, 24-hour news channel, or it's being on social media, or it's joining in conversations about dieting. There's a lot of choices that we make. So although we could blame social media, we could blame, and for sure, like, I'm an advocate for all that. I'm on an organization for safety in social media, organization to change the on boards for changing the conversation about eating disorders. But at the end of the day, not much changes quickly or easily. So we only can change ourselves. And we are forgetting often that we can curate our lives better than we do. And that can help us connect to our own hungers, hunger for relationships, hunger for food, hunger for sleep, all of these hungers that we have.
I love that you use the word curate, because it's an intentional word, isn't it? It has to do with, I guess, that ability to have some authority in your own life and what your life looks like as much as possible, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it used to be easier, when I was a kid.
I know. How often do we say that now?
When I was a kid, there were people whose yards you didn't cross through because you knew that person was going to come out and yell at you, "Don't walk on my lawn." I still can feel that feeling of being a little girl and being like, but sometimes you still did it because you needed to get home fast by the curfew or whatever. And so you just hoped that person wasn't going to come out and scream at you, but usually they did, because they're kind of seemed like they're just watching out the window waiting.
Yes, I think they were. My grandparents' neighbor was like that, and she had dichondra. And so it was cool in the summer. And so I used to roll over onto it and then roll back.
So I think because so much is happening where it's a touch of a button instead of you're walking through someone's lawn, you knew, right? You knew if you did that rolling through the cool, the cool grasses, then you were at risk for being yelled at. I knew that if I cut through certain people's lawns, I was at risk of being yelled at. It was an intentional choice. I made the choice. It was worth the risk, but there was such an awareness. And now I think we've given up on recognizing that we have the awareness to choose to turn that channel on, to choose to, if we go on social media, look at this or that, or choose to put notifications on or off. All of these choices we make have to become more intentional. We choose to shop at a certain grocery store or order takeout instead of cooking, or whatever it is, whatever the choices we're making. Our lives have been, we get so much external stimuli that slowing down to check out, what is it? If I was curating my life, how would I do it? Would I be getting up in the morning and turning the news on? I think these are questions we need to be asking. What are the habits that I'm in that if I were designing my life today, I wouldn't be engaging in these habits? Because our brain takes in messages and then it assumes they're messages we want to be taking in. The choice has to be whether we take them in or not. And we really can do a much better job, not crossing through the lawn 10 times a day. So it's like if once a week I crossed through that lawn and got yelled at, that didn't really harm me, my self-esteem or thinking I'm a good person, or I just knew okay, it's worth the risk. This person's that's how they are. But if I'm doing that 20, 30 times a day, it does start chipping away at you to think I must not care about other people, or I must be a bad person, or why am I doing this? Or, the messages that we're getting are just really destructive. And most are about being smaller physically, emotionally, wanting less. And I don't mean that in the materialistic sense, but just in a spiritual sense, in a relational sense,
I think that we cause a lot of our own suffering. This is something that I think about because of these ideas or these expectations, these kind of parameters we've created or we've been taught. It could be a mixture of that. I feel like that suffering is something we bring on because we hold ourselves to this kind of idea or ideal. I'm not talking morality or things that are really good for us, but I'm talking about outside of that. Like one of the things I've always struggled with, and I have no idea where this comes from. Well, I could probably psychoanalyze it quicker than that, but the word big, because I'm 5'11" and I'm not waif thin. And that word big used to really bother me. I think it still does. And my daughter, who's 5'10", the other day was saying, I really feel good about my size. Now she's narrower, but she's tall and she has naturally broad shoulders and narrow hips, but it's like we're built different, but she sees it differently. And I think that's because I intentionally tried to curate, I suppose, something I still haven't handled myself. You know what I mean? And I think as women, if you're 5'11", proportionate to that height, and most people in your life who are male are below that, they use verbiage, right? And so this idea of our relationship with, I never really had an eating disorder, but I did have a cheer director in college, and I was super fit in college. I was swimming and playing volleyball and cheering, and she poked me in my stomach one day, and she would do public weigh-ins and comment on your weight when you were being weighed. And I have to look back now as I'm talking to you and think there had to be girls where that just rocked their world. Like there was a moment when I kind of was like, okay, I'm going to eat lemon juice on my salad. And it started to mess with my stomach. And I was like, wait a minute, why am I doing this? But I think more often than not, like the thought is still in my head. I'm just not necessarily making damaging decisions, but that suffering comes from living that memory or living that perceived failure to the standard that we hold. Does that make sense?
And our language, whether it's language other people are, putting upon us or whether we're doing to ourselves, really matters so much. And like you said, that word big can be very triggering for girls, especially, and women. And it's in a similar way, the word healthy has become a triggering word for people. Can become is usually a triggering word for people who are trying to recover from anorexia nervosa, because they see it happened to me the other night on a call with a client. Someone had said to them, you look healthier. And that was just terrible because that meant bigger. Now to someone in a larger body, you look healthier means thinner. So whatever we want it to mean is what it means, but it's usually not a description that is an acceptance of somebody at their body shape and size as they're meant to be, because no one outside of anyone knows what that is, because we're all completely different from everybody else. Unless you're an identical twin, you don't have anyone exactly like you. And so no one can really tell you what you should look like, what you should weigh. They can maybe tell you what a minimum is for sure, where you'll be healthy. But other than that, not really, but we act as if that's very obvious what people should weigh and how they should look. And so then we use this language that is really tough. I wish we would stick with tall instead of big, not because I think big should cause anybody to feel bad about themselves, but it does.
It does.
So if we switched over to tall, that would be good. The other word that I would like to change if I could is fat, because fat in food and fat on bodies are two very different things. And if you say to someone, you need more fats, they hear the word fat. And fat has become a pejorative, negative word, even though everybody has fat on their bodies and we need fat on our bodies. So we're all fat. That's the truth. We're actually all fat. Babies are fat. We come out fat and we stay fat. We have to have fat, part of us. But we've taken these words that are just like normal descriptions of factual biology of who we are, and we've turned them into these negative. And then, like you said, we do all this comparing too, and comparing is so destructive.
It's what we value, isn't it? What we think would make us happy, maybe, or what would make the people around us happy. I think we stuff what you said, allowing ourselves to be hungry. I think we stuff hunger in order to stabilize either what we're thinking or the real world that we're living in, because it does in some families. A friend of mine, their family, it's all about what you weigh. Like it's everything, all conversations. You see great aunt so-and-so and you haven't seen her in 10 years. The first thing she comments on is how you look. And that's, you don't, it looks like you've gained a little weight. Like your whole world hinges on how much you weigh. And so I think, obviously, culturally as women, we're in this really interesting time where there's this swing. It hasn't gotten rid of the cultural, like what quote beauty is, but there's a swing now where they call it, is it fat acceptance or, that sort of thing. So healthiness is not still necessarily the conversation. We're still doing that external focus, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because it really is true that you can be healthy at almost any size. That's not true of being very underweight, actually. because your body shuts down and decides what it doesn't need, what functions it doesn't need, like to circulate blood all the way to your fingertips or grow hair or whatever, and it starts shutting down. So that is true that you can't be healthy at a very underweight size, but instead of focusing on the parameters and the medical markers of, oh, your cholesterol is high, how can we bring your cholesterol down? It's like, well, you should lose weight. Instead of thinking like, oh, I need a knee replacement, how can I do that? Well, you really need to lose weight before we give you a knee replacement. There's so much focus on weight in our medical communities, which is very destructive. And to your point about your cheer director, which seems like, oh, that should be really outdated by now. In PE classes across this country, kids are being weighed by people who know nothing about children's weights, nothing about possibly triggering eating disorders, nothing about the shaming messaging that goes on. And, if you have more muscle or you're bigger boned, or it doesn't even matter. Forget any of that. Just the literal diversity of weights, shapes, and sizes we are as humans. And it doesn't matter if you are taller, right, as a girl. And so, of course, you weigh more, because that is a pretty strong correlation, weight and height. You are embarrassed of your weight because it's going to be higher than the average girl in your class. And you're going to feel like you weigh too much, even though you may be actually in a smaller body proportionally. But it doesn't matter, because it's like some girls are still in the double digits and you're in the triple digits. And that's a big thing growing up. So there's all these ways that we give people leeway to talk about things outside of their scope of expertise. And it causes a lot of destruction. And there should not be weights going on in schools, except by a nurse. I mean, if a nurse needs to weigh a kid because they're doing medication, they're medical professionals, go for it. They can weigh the kid. But why are we weighing kids in PE classes? It's all about this fear. Again, fear of obesity. What? Why are we so afraid of being bigger? Instead, let's be afraid of cholesterol going up. Let's work on that. Let's be afraid of, giving kids so much homework that they can't go out and play after school. Let's be afraid of that, not having a bigger body.
And a lot of us, as we enter midlife, the level of stress, the level of responsibility, and the hormonal shifts, our bodies become literally another entity that we don't understand again. It's like puberty, but worse, in some ways. It literally is a challenge. And are you meeting with women in our age group that are struggling with that?
I mean, I can tell you personally that when I was going through menopause, thankfully I've been through it for a while, it was a question for me whether to do hormone replacement, because I know that if I don't do hormone replacement, I may gain weight, right? That's not, there's other reasons, and there were other factors I was considering. That was the only thing. But it is uncomfortable for your body to change from the body you've known it to be. It's not even necessarily a fear of not measuring up to someone else. It's like, well, this is who I am, and I've known my body my whole life. And now all of a sudden I'm going to shift hormones and my body is going to change too. And that is what gave me pause. To be honest, I've never talked about it before, but it gave me pause. And then I was like, you mentioned the word values. And I was like, yeah, but also sometimes hormones cause cancer. So I think I'm going to just let my body change. And that's not to say people shouldn't take hormones. This is a very personal decision, but it's one as women we have to grapple with. And I don't know what doctors say to people in their private offices about these decisions. But I know that for me, I tend to like read a lot before I make a decision like that. And I didn't want to take any chances, so I erred on the side of letting my body change, and it did, and being a little bit more safe with my health. Mm-hmm. So the weight change, maybe a doctor would say you should lose that weight. But for me, I would rather have the health of not taking the hormones. It's like this for that. We are again curating our lives, right? Making decisions. And we can't really just sit back and be on autopilot when these decisions come up, because they have real life consequences one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there's this interesting movement in midlife women where it's like, accept the gray hair, which I love, and accepting the shift of aging. You're seeing a lot of actresses that are in our age group that are hitting that point where you still look young-ish, you haven't totally tipped, and the conversations are being had by influential women, which I love. And some quite a bit older women are very outspoken about aging and allowing it to be what it is. But I find that we still sometimes have that standard of, but you need to look like a model. Like, you can have the gray hair, you can do this, but you still need to be slim and small or whatever. So we still have to be mindful of what we're focusing on, don't we?
Yeah, I do find that gets easier in midlife for most women and most men. To be honest, like, our values start to illuminate more clearly. We've been in our careers a while. We've made whatever decisions we've made about having children or not having children, and like whatever changes we were going to make or big life decisions we were going to make, most of those have been made. And it's not to say we can't make other big decisions, but there's a settling in of those values. And I think it's a beautiful time to actually curate, going back to that word and allowing ourselves to figure out, okay, what have I been ignoring that I've been hungry for, whether it's travel or time off, or I want to write a book. I mean, I wrote the book I wrote, I was after menopause, right? So like, I'm not young. I wrote that book because I thought, well, I have all this knowledge that I've accumulated, but I see one person at a time. How many people can I share this with? And what we know about binge eating anyway is that most people don't come for help because there's so much shame around it, because we're supposed to have control over food. And so anytime someone loses control over food, there's a lot of shame. And so I wanted to write a book that would give people the tools that I have, so they could use them on their own and not have to come into the office and talk about it. Sometimes talking about things is really hard, also costs money. And so, that way it's just a book. But yeah, your values start to, I think, kind of clarify as you get a little bit older, and so the binge eating healing may become hopefully less about losing weight, though I think everybody hopes they will. Most people do. Most people will say it outright. But it also becomes about just that doesn't feel good to lose control anymore. People want to have more positive sense of control in their lives. They've been holding down jobs, raising families, or trying to figure out, paying off student loans, whatever they're doing. And I think it is a time there's still a lot of stress, but there's also like the light coming through, like a little bit more ease as well, because the mental load of decision making isn't quite as high.
And I think we sometimes are just done with shackles. We're like so over it. There's this point where you kind of tip toward, no, I'm not doing that or feeling that anymore.
Exactly. And that is usually, to me, when I hear about it, it's usually shutting down hunger. It's like shutting down your voice, shutting down that you really want to paint. It's shutting down that you don't want to have a big house anymore and you want to have like a little apartment somewhere and travel. Or it is shutting down these messages of not being able to have what you want.
It's like a day of reckoning or a season of reckoning, like what we've done, where we're at, and where we want to go, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that part of the food process as well?
It is part of the food process, because there comes a point where people want to, if they want to have dessert every day, they want to be able to do that. You know, they're tired of following the rules, and also have a lot of awareness that that has led to deprivation in other parts of their lives. So eating disorders go on and on and on, that go on and on and on, years and decades sometimes. I met someone once who was in their 70s and came in for treatment for an eating disorder, and it had interfered in everything. You know, it interferes in laying down memories, because what happens is if you're depriving yourself of food or trying to, that is such a, our eating is such a primitive part of us, really. Our need for food, like you said, we can't live without it. It's primitive. So it is stronger than everything else. So if we're constantly trying to diet and deprive ourselves, then food is on our mind all the time, because we need it to survive. So then when we're talking to our friends or our family, or we're planning for an event or trying to go get ready for an event, we're thinking about food, weight, body shape, instead of being present in the moments. So there's a lot of lost time in our own lives, in our relationships, in learning. I mean, people will say to me that they don't remember what they learned. They really don't have a lot of memories during times when their eating disorders were the worst. And for some people, that has gone on for years and years.
That's interesting that when you talk about food, how if we're preoccupied with it, that it robs your life. It's not isolated from everything else. Mm-mm. So that would mean your relationships with people.
Totally.
What you're capable of in your career or your craft.
Yeah.
Wow, that's powerful. I can't even imagine. But I would love to know, what would 3 key takeaways be for you to help someone who might be hearing this and it's resonating somewhere? Maybe they haven't acknowledged it yet, you know? Maybe it's a habit that's so normal, like in my friend's family, this is what you do to be accepted. Mm-hmm. Or to keep great aunt so-and-so from being too critical. What 3 takeaways would you give to the listeners today?
Number 1, I would say stop dieting. Dieting either causes deprivation and obsessive thoughts about eating and food and weight and body, or it causes binging, which causes shame and isolation and all kinds of other things. So dieting doesn't work 95% of the time. You wouldn't buy a car that didn't work 95% of the time. You wouldn't, use a phone that didn't work 95% of the time. Even if it didn't work 5% of the time, you might question it. But for some reason, we keep thinking, oh, but this diet's going to be different. This fat is going to be different. This will work. So I would say number 1 is stop dieting, because it is the first domino that usually falls. And even if it's not your dieting in action, you want to be dieting or you have the diet mindset. So all of that I would say is number 1. That's the most important takeaway. Number 2, I would say, is not really eating disorder related, but it's related to like bigger conversation about hunger and our hungers. Relationships turn out to be the key to happiness, health, and longevity. So if you want to be happy and healthy and live a long life, and you want to invest in one thing, invest in your relationships. It is, if you look at the studies on longevity, that is the factor that comes out. The Harvard Health study that's been following people over decades, that's the shocking research results. And so I would say, let's stop talking about our bodies as the thing that's going to cause us to be happy, healthy, and live a long time. It is usually relationships. And so no dieting, focus on your relationships. And then number 3, I would say really would be to curate your environment and decide, choose mindfully and intentionally, how do you want to talk to yourself? How do you want to talk to other people? What other voices do you want to listen to? Who are the voices that lift you up, the voices that make you want to be better than you are and happier and healthier than you are? Is it, you can ask yourself 2 questions when you're curating your environment. Is this healthy? And is this helpful? Those are the only two questions you really need to ask to get started. If it's healthy or helpful, consider keeping it. If it's both, keep it. If it's neither, you need to slow down and really check in with yourself about why you're doing it. So those would be my 3 takeaways.
Those are such powerful, practical parameters for a life well lived, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Gia, for spending time and having this really beneficial conversation with me and sharing real talk about the realities of things and bringing such a kindness to the conversation. There was no judgment to it. It was just consider this. And I love the way that you presented the information. I think it's very easy to hear and to receive. And I think that it's very powerful and helpful. So I really do appreciate you saying yes and coming on my show today.
Thank you so much. Your podcasts are really filling such an important void in our dialogue and serving such an important community and giving voices to so many different helpful and healthy messages. Talk about Curate, right? You're doing it as you're inviting guests on. And I'm grateful for you.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you so much. Friends, today I've been speaking with Dr. Gia-Marson, psychologist and author of the Binge Eating Prevention Workbook. If you head on over to www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 252, you will be able to find links to Dr. Gia and her website and her book. Also, while you're there, please leave your name and email address. I send out periodic encouraging emails. Friends, this was a powerful conversation about hunger, not just food, but the things that we desire in our life, in our relationships, in our goals, in our environment, and learning to feel that hunger in a healthy way. This is something that I feel like midlife brings, right? That kind of reckoning with how have we spent our life and do we like how it's turning out and do we want to do things differently? And the beauty is maybe we're happy with some things, maybe we're not happy with other things, but we do have the ability to hunger healthy and live life each day in a way that's curated, in a way that's designed to bring joy. So I want to encourage you to continue to stay engaged in the Feminine Roadmap community. Find those podcasts that encourage you and give you the tools and the techniques that will help you live that life that you really want to live. Be brave, my friends. Have courage. Be healthy. Be well. And live the life you were meant to live every single day. Take care, my friends. I look forward to talking with you again next week. Bye-bye.